let's be honest, not many of us are out there saying that the second Iron Man film is better than the first one. If you do, that's totally great, and you're entitled to your opinions, but I just don't see many people saying that this film is better than its predecessor, which is totally fine, because sequels don't always need to be better than the original to be a good film. Although, that would be nice, wouldn't it? However, Iron Man 2 manages to fall on the other side of the spectrum of the MCU. While many consider the first Iron Man to be one of the very best MCU films, a lot of those very same people would say that this sequel is easily one of the worst. For me, I've mostly had negative feelings toward this movie in the past. While I do think it's much more enjoyable than The Incredible Hulk, but then again, almost anything is, there have been times where I rewatched the film and just said, it may be more enjoyable, but it's so much worse in quality. Sometimes I've really enjoyed it, and other times I've cringed basically the whole way through. So, it may surprise some of you to know that this time around, I actually had an absolute blast with the movie. I legitimately had one of the most enjoyable experiences with this film that I've ever had. Do I think it's a good film? Not even close. Let's talk about it. You know the drill. Spoilers ahead for Iron Man 2 and the rest of the MCU. You've been warned. So, yeah, I enjoyed the movie. Why is that? Why did I happen to like the film this time around that I've come very close to even hating before? Well, I'll give you 3 words. Robert Downey Jr. Oh, and we can also throw in a couple more words, I guess. How about Jon Favreau? While Iron Man is undoubtedly one of the best characters in the MCU, I've never been one to advocate loudly for his trilogy. I think it has its problems, especially with the second and third installments, but upon rewatching this film, it just became so abundantly clear now why Marvel had to get him to stay through the end of Endgame. His charisma and charm are so unbelievably magnetic that he could essentially carry any movie as long as he's playing this character. Which is actually sort of the problem, because while I was watching this movie, I was like, yeah, Robert Downey Jr. is so good as Tony that I'd watch him do anything and still have a great time. And then I stopped, and then I went, well, what does that make Iron Man 2? Because underneath the wonderful charm of this character is a film that is so deeply flawed and very problematic, but maybe still enjoyable. So what went wrong? I mean, most of the team from the first film came back, so it should be a recipe for success, right? I mean, you bring in the Russo brothers for 4 MCU films, and each one grosses more and more, and soon they're directing Avengers Endgame. Jon Favreau is back behind the helm, all the cast returned except for Terrence Howard, and yes, we will get to War Machine, but it should have been a slam dunk. When I shut off this movie, I could pinpoint 2 major problems that the film had. It was actually rather simple. You see, I actually did see a good movie in Iron Man 2, but it was buried underneath layers of junk and just unnecessary elements, but it was there, I'm sure of it. So what were these 2 problems? The first is the villain problem. And I think it was right around here when Marvel began to develop their quote-unquote villain problem, and it began to take shape. Now, for some context, what is their villain problem? I'm planning on doing a video sometime later detailing what it is in depth and how they were able to sort of fix it in Phase 3, but in short, it's essentially where their villains tend to be very, very one-dimensional and have thin motivations that are exploited and turn out to mostly just be, I'm very evil. We saw that towards the end of Iron Man 1 with Jeff Bridges. His character went off the rails and the rest is history. So let's look at the 2 villains of this film. The movie opens with Ivan Vanko and his father Anton, who dies shortly after Tony reveals himself to be Iron Man. Now, right away, this is done much better than in Iron Man 1, as Favreau very clearly establishes the motivation. Anton Vanko was cut out of the Stark inheritance, so to speak, and now he wants his son to avenge him. It's simple, it's effective, it works. I actually have no problem with this at all. What I do have a problem with is this. Let's try to answer the question of why Ivan Vanko A, uses his technology to build whips, of all things, but more seriously, B, why he heads to Monaco. Let's get the obvious question out of the way. Is he there to kill Tony Stark? The answer is actually no. I think, in his mind, that would be a bonus, but as he explains to Tony later, if he can make God bleed, then people would cease to believe in him. So according to Ivan, he went to Monaco to show the world that Iron Man was weak. And then his mastermind plan was to sit in prison for the rest of his life, because that makes total sense. Because he gets caught very quickly and defeated by Tony, and then he tells him, I'm gonna just sit here and watch you die in prison. But as Tony points out rather aptly, how are you going to watch me if you're in prison? So then Justin Hammer breaks him out of prison and brings him in to build his robots or drones or whatever he wants him to build. First of all, there is no hint anywhere in the film that Vanko had any idea who Justin Hammer was, And if there was a clue, then clearly I missed it. So it's just a happy accident that Ivan is let out of prison and sent to build the drones, I guess. From there, his motivation is to kill Tony again, I suppose. And then he builds a bunch of drones and gets into another big metal suit. And the climax is 3 metal suits fighting instead of 2, like in the last film, with a bunch of drones, because the more the merrier, I guess. But he's not the only villain on the scene, because let's talk about Justin Hammer. So, in a completely separate arc, Hammer is a rival to Tony, and Tony basically completely embarrasses him in front of the entire country in a Senate hearing. There's another good motivation, actually, that's set up. It's kind of played off here because Sam Rockwell, who is a phenomenal actor, by the way, plays this character so over the top. It just makes any scene that he's in hard to believe and take seriously. Anyways, he just so happens to see Ivan at Monaco, and he thinks to himself, this is a guy who jumped out onto a racetrack to kill Tony Stark with electrical whips. They weren't able to track down where he was from. There's no record of anyone who knows him. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to entrust him with my entire reputation and livelihood, and even risk going to jail, because guess what? He does go to jail later, to a criminal who tried to murder another man in front of everyone with whips, because I'm Justin Hammer. And you know what I say to that?
Not a great plan.
Because here's the thing. I know I talked a lot about this issue, but I feel like it's important, and one of the reasons that this film doesn't work. It's because the villains are dumb. They're thinly layered, and their motivations make little to no sense whatsoever. They make dumb decision after dumb decision until they just so happen to die or get sent to jail. So let's move on to the second major problem that I think this film has, and believe it or not, it's actually the same problem that a lot of critics argued Infinity War had, and that's overstuffing. However, I'm here to point out why I think Infinity War and Iron Man 2 tried to do the same thing, and why Infinity War succeeded and why Iron Man 2 didn't. And I think it's actually for a very, very simple reason. Overstuffing a movie is generally a bad thing. It means that the filmmakers have way too many things that they want to put in the movie, and instead of trying to figure out what to cut, they just put it all in and try to make it work. This usually happens with sequels, and it's actually very, very natural because the inclination after you make a hit first movie is to try to go big or go home. Infinity War, as we all know, tries to stuff the entirety of the MCU in one film. I mean, I'd argue it's more overstuffed than Endgame by a long shot, because 2/3 of Endgame focuses on like 10 characters. See, in my eyes, there's 2 ways that a person can approach a movie. You can either streamline it and have just one really big storyline going on with some undercurrents, which is your endgame. You follow one storyline for almost the entire film. Infinity War is the other option, though, where you follow several different storylines simultaneously. So let's get back to Iron Man 2. Upon this rewatch, you'd be surprised just how many different storylines Jon Favreau tries to put in this film, because there are a lot. First of all, there's the story of Pepper becoming CEO, which could have been interesting, but it certainly wasn't in this movie. Then they introduce Black Widow and try to make her character stand out. But not only do they introduce Black Widow, but they also try to fully introduce Nick Fury and all of S.H.I.E.L.D. into this movie. And on top of that, you have the weird coincidental colliding arcs of Justin Hammer and Ivan Vanko, who I guess are both motivated by their want to kill Tony. And then on top of that, you have Tony's Palladium core problem, where he finds out that he's dying, and then proceeds into an existential crisis for the majority of the film. Now, if I stopped right there, I could also point out something else to you. Infinity War is probably even worse in this regard, just on face value, as it has storylines about Thor trying to get a new axe, and then this team going to Wakanda to get Vision's stone out, and then this team trying to lure Thanos to Titan while Thanos himself is trying to get the Soul Stone. But do you know what the difference between the two are? It's that in Infinity War, the stories overlap and connect. In Iron Man 2, although some of the stories do overlap, none of the stories actually connect at the end of the film in a cohesive way. Sure, one by one all of the stories are wrapped up, but they aren't connected. Tony solving his core issue has nothing to do with Ivan Vanko, and Ivan Vanko has nothing to do with Pepper being CEO, which has little to do with S.H.I.E.L.D. Again, some of these stories do overlap, absolutely, like Pepper becoming CEO and then hiring Black Widow, but they don't seem to fit like a puzzle. It's more like throwing darts at a wall and having about 90% of them stick. I mean, sure, they're on the wall and they stuck, but they don't really have anything in common other than that. So those are my 2 biggest problems with the film, and I know I talked a lot about them, but I feel like it was important to, lay the groundwork for why this film doesn't work. Because within these individual elements, there are actually some really, really, really great moments. First of all, when the film opens, I found myself thoroughly enjoying the first 20 minutes or so. Because again, at this point, storylines were being set up, so you really don't have a sense for how discordant they are and how discordant they were going to be later on. Like I said before, I really thought Ivan's motivations were set up well. And as far as Senate hearings go, that was also really entertaining. I know courtroom scenes are usually pretty dull, but Robert Downey Jr. can make anything fun. That's this film's biggest strength by far, like I mentioned before, is just Robert Downey Jr. because he's able to light up any scene that he's in, except the party scene. But we'll get there. We're also introduced to Don Cheadle, who would go on to play War Machine for the rest of his MCU run. So, do I think he's better than Terrence Howard? In this film, actually, no. It's very strange to see him because I'm so used to the very likable, charismatic, funny Rhodey that we begin to see in Iron Man 3 leading into Age of Ultron and Civil War. But this version of War Machine is the military guy. He's rigid and uptight, but he cares about Tony, and I think Cheadle did play him like that intentionally. I actually felt a very similar way about Black Widow. Johansson came such a long way in 11 years because comparing her line delivery here versus in Endgame, in the scene where she's talking to Rhodey about Clint, it's incredible. A lot of Johansson's line delivery in Iron Man 2 feels very, very wooden, and there's just not much to her character besides the spy aspect. Anyways, going back to the film, we then begin to see Tony's deterioration as the palladium cores begin to deplete. Right there is the first great movie hidden within this mess. I know it may have been controversial for them to try to adapt the Demon in the Bottle story, but there was something there that Favreau could have run with. It would have been a huge departure from the first Iron Man, but would it have been worth it? I personally think so. From there, we begin to stack storylines and then it just gets messy. After a while, we begin flipping back and forth between these arcs and it just doesn't feel like a cohesive story anymore. I'll admit that I enjoyed the film for a lot longer than I usually do, maybe up until the halfway mark this time, but from that point on, it just felt like a collection of fun scenes that were a complete mess and they were just stitched together. But let me say that there are some really great scenes in this film. First of all, the Mark V suit-up scene is just awesome. The CGI is still so unbelievably good, lest we forget that 8 years later we would be getting this. Instead of this. And later, when Tony is trying to create the new element, there are some really great scenes of just Tony being a tinker and, being a genius again, which are always some of my favorite scenes. When Tony is tinkering, that just feels like Tony, and it feels right. I really love those scenes. Then we cut to the scenes where he's sitting in a donut, or he's just smashing watermelons with his Iron Man suit while he's drunk in the party. And that party scene could have worked so much better if the film had taken his mental instability much more seriously. It's kind of the same issue I actually had with Thor in Endgame. I admire the Russos for going that extra mile and doing something bold with the character, but then it just kind of became a joke at a certain point. It's actually much the same here. While Favreau does try to show us just how self-destructive Tony is, he ends up making it feel more like a joke than anything else, which undercuts the serious elements of all of it. So, is Iron Man 2 as bad as everyone says it is? I honestly don't think so. I think from a critical perspective, there's a lot to pick at here, and I've talked a lot about what I dislike, but I think there's actually also a lot to like. We take for granted just how good the cast is with Robert Downey Jr. at the lead, and I think it's important to recognize that building good characters is so difficult. It just doesn't come that easy. Iron Man 2 has a lot of things going for it, and unfortunately, a lot of them just don't pan out. This is one of the films where the rating system may be a little deceiving because the rating system is meant to evaluate a film. It won't necessarily encapsulate my personal feelings, though. When the Infinity Saga rewatch is all said and done and I rank the 23 films, who knows? Iron Man 2 may be higher up on the list than it normally would have been. Again, though, this is a review, so sadly, although I really wanted to give it a B-, I'm going to give Iron Man 2 a C+ and a 6.8 out of 10. Also, I still hate this scene so much every single time I watch this film.
I want my bird. A bird?
What did you think about Iron Man 2? Next up is Thor, so if you want to see more of my content, make sure to subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. Comment down below with your favorite Iron Man 2 scene, and remember to check out the description for more of my content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.